Hey, welcome back to Books and Coffee. In this video, we are going to explore some of the most important literary movements, their key features, approximate periods of origin, and major writers. Let's begin with Metaphysical Poets, early 17th century. So, Metaphysical Poets emerged in the early 60s during a time of intense religious conflict, scientific discovery, and philosophical questioning in England. The Renaissance had expanded knowledge, a new astronomy and science were challenging traditional beliefs. In this atmosphere of intellectual tension, poets like John Donne, George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, and Henry Wong began writing poetry that fused emotion with reasoning. They reacted against the smooth, decorative poetry of the Elizabethan age. So instead of simple love lyrics, they used complex arguments, surprising metaphors, and comparisons drawn from science, geography, and religion. Their poetry reflects a world where faith, doubt, love, and mortality all collide in the mind. Cavalier Poets. The Cavalier Poets wrote during the period leading up to the English Civil War. They were supporters of King Charles I and represented the royalist aristocratic side of society. So, they wrote during 6030s to 6040s. Their poetry reflects courtly culture, loyalty to the monarchy, and a desire to enjoy life despite political uncertainty. Writers like Robert Herrick, Richard Lovelace, Thomas Carew, and Sir John Suckling emphasized themes of love, beauty, wine, and carpe diem, meaning seize the day. Unlike the Metaphysicals, their style was smooth and musical. Their work often feels like a reaction against the seriousness and moral strictness of the Puritans who were gaining power at that time. Graveyard Poets during mid-18th century. The Graveyard Poets appeared in the 70s when Enlightenment reason dominated European thought. These poets turned away from rational optimism and focused instead on death, decay, and the limits of human life. Influenced by growing interest in the Gothic and the sublime, writers like Thomas Gray, Edward Young, and Robert Blair wrote meditative poems set in graveyards at night. Their works reflect social changes, including urban growth and a fading sense of religious certainty. This movement helped prepare the way for Romanticism by emphasizing emotion, nature, and individual reflection. Pre-Raphaelite Movement, founded during 1848. The Pre-Raphaelite movement began as an artistic brotherhood in Victorian England, a time marked by industrialization, materialism, and strict social norms. Writers such as Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Christina Rossetti, William Morris, and Swinburne shared the painter's desire to return to the rich detail and spiritual sincerity of art before the painter Raphael. They rejected modern industrial ugliness and turned toward medieval themes, romance, symbolism, and intense beauty. Their poetry often combines religious feeling, sensuality, and dreamlike imagery, reflecting a protest against Victorian practicality. Fleshly School of Poetry during 1870s. The Fleshly School was not a self-declared group but a term used by the critic Robert Buchanan to attack poets like Rossetti and Swinburne. He accused them of excessive sensuality and moral decadence. This reflects the tension in Victorian society between strict morality and artistic freedom. These poets explored physical beauty, passion, and desire in ways that shocked conservative readers. Oxford or Tractarian movement from 1833. The Oxford movement began as a religious revival within the Church of England. Leaders like John Henry Newman and John Keble were reacting against what they saw as the decline of spiritual authority and the rise of secular politics. Their influence on literature encouraged devotional, reflective poetry with moral seriousness. So this shows how religion still deeply shaped Victorian intellectual life. Lake School during 1790s. The Lake School poets Wordsworth, Coleridge and Southey wrote during the French Revolution and early Industrial Revolution. Society was changing rapidly and faith in reason and progress had been shaken by political violence. So these poets turned to nature, childhood and personal emotion as source of truth. Living in the Lake District, they believed poetry should use everyday language and express genuine feeling. So their work helped define Romanticism as a movement centered on imagination and individual experience. The term Lake School was used by Francis Jeffrey, a powerful critic of the time and editor of the Edinburgh Review in the early 19th century. He and other conservative reviews used it to the group include Wordsworth, Coleridge and Southey together because they lived in the Lake District. The label carried a mocking tone, suggesting they were a little provincial, overly emotional and obsessed with nature instead of proper classical taste. Cockney School during 1810s. It's a critical term. The Cockney School label was used by conservative critics to mock London-based writers from humble backgrounds, including John Keats and Leigh Hunt. Britain was still class-conscious, and these writers were criticized for their lower class origins and sensuous style. Their poetry celebrated beauty, imagination, and art for its own sake, pushing back against rigid social hierarchy. Imagist Poets from 1912. Imagism developed just before World War I, when modern life felt fragmented and fast. Poets like Ezra Pound, H.D., and Amy Lowell rejected long, emotional Victorian poetry. They wanted precision, clarity, and sharp visual images. Influenced by Japanese haiku and classical Greek poetry, they believed poetry should present an image directly without unnecessary words. Auden Group during 1930s. The Auden Group formed during the Great Depression and the rise of fascism in Europe. Poets such as W.H. Auden, Stephen Spender, and Louis MacNeice believed poetry should address political crisis and social responsibility. Their work reflects anxiety about war, capitalism, and modern society. Movement Poets during 1950s. After World War II, some British poets reacted against complex modernist poetry. Writers like Philip Larkin and Kingsley Amis preferred clear language, traditional forms, and everyday subjects. This reflected post-war realism and skepticism toward grand ideals. Angry Young Men. This is also during 1950s. This group of writers expressed frustration with Britain's class system and limited opportunities after the war. Authors like John Osborne and Allen portrayed working and middle-class anger, realism, and disillusionment. Augustan Satirical School during early 18th century. In the age of political stability after civil conflict, writers like Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift used satire to criticize society. They valued order, reason, and classical balance, mocking human foolishness. Pre-Romantics or eve of Romanticism during late 18th century. Poets like William Blake and Robert Burns began emphasizing emotion, imagination, and nature before Romanticism fully developed. They reacted against strict classical rules and Enlightenment rationalism. University Wits. The University Wits were a group of late 16th century writers active roughly in the 1580s and 1590s during the Elizabethan age. They were called University Wits because most of them were educated at Oxford or Cambridge, which was rare for writers at that time. England was experiencing a surge of learning due to the Renaissance, and these men brought classical knowledge into English drama. They helped transform English theatre from simple morality plays into complex literary drama. Writers such as Christopher Marlowe, Robert Greene, Thomas Nashe, Thomas Lodge, and John experimented with powerful blank verse, ambitious tragic heroes, and dramatic structure. They prepared the ground for Shakespeare by raising the intellectual and artistic level of English drama. Romantic Movement. The Romantic movement, beginning around 1798 with the publication of lyrical ballads by Wordsworth and Coleridge, arose as a reaction against the rationalism of the Enlightenment and the social disruption of the Industrial Revolution. Factories, urbanization, and political revolutions made life feel mechanical and unstable. Romantic poets valued emotion, imagination, nature, childhood, and the individual spirit. They believed poetry should express personal experience and deep feeling. Major poets include Wordsworth, Coleridge, Lord Byron, Shelley, and John Keats. The Victorian literary movement. The Victorian literary movement, spanning roughly 1837 to 1901 during Queen Victoria's reign, developed in an age of industrial expansion, empire, scientific discovery, and moral seriousness. Society faced conflict between religious faith and scientific ideas like Darwin's theory of evolution. Victorian poetry often deals with doubt, social responsibility, and the role of the individual in a rapidly changing world. Poets such as Tennyson, Robert Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Matthew Arnold combined emotional depth with moral reflection. Aestheticism. Aestheticism, emerging in the late 19th century, promoted the idea of art for art's sake. It arose partly as a reaction against Victorian moral strictness and the demand that literature should teach lessons. Aesthetic writers believed beauty itself was a purpose of art. They valued style, elegance, and sensory experience over moral messages. Key figures include Oscar Wilde, Walter Pater, and Charles Swinburne. Symbolism. Symbolism, influential in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, began in France but strongly affected English poetry. It developed as a reaction against realism and materialism. Symbolist poets believed that truth could not be expressed directly but only through symbols, suggestion, and musical language. This movement influenced modern poetry's interest in mood and inner experience. English language poets influenced by symbolism include W.B. Yeats. Modernism. Modernism, developing in the early 20th century, especially after World War I, reflects a world shattered by war, loss of faith, and rapid technological change. Writers felt traditional forms could no longer express modern experience. Modernist literature often uses fragmented structure, myth, and experimental language. Poets such as T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and W.B. Yeats explored alienation, spiritual emptiness, and the search for meaning. The Georgian Poets. The Georgian Poets, active roughly from 1910 to the early 1920s, were named after King George V. They reacted against late Victorian heaviness and preferred simple language and rural subjects. Their poetry often presents peaceful nature scenes and traditional forms, standing between Victorian poetry and modernism. Rupert Brooke, Walter de la Mare, and John Masefield are associated with this group. War Poets of World War I. The war poets of World War I, writing between 1914 and 1918, responded directly to the horrors of modern warfare. Early patriotic enthusiasm gave way to realism and protest as soldiers experienced trench warfare. Poets like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Robert Brooke showed the physical and physiological trauma of war, challenging romantic ideas of heroism. Literary movements show how writers respond to history, politics, religion, and human experience. And it is very important for us to understand the history of literature and while preparing for your competitive exams. Thank you.